She came to that highway to die, $18 in her pocket, a dead phone, a photograph of a son she had been grieving for 3 years. She was going to walk into the Nevada desert and let the cold finish what the grief had started. She was on her knees beside an ATM machine at 2 in the morning when she heard a child's voice rising from somewhere beneath the ground. There was a girl here before you. Her name was Emma. She said her mother was a soldier. She said soldiers always come when you call their name. I've been saying it every night for 3 months. Ruth Mackenzie had not cried since they put her son in the ground. She cried then, and then she got up. 72 hours later, 173 motorcycles would converge on that same highway, and nothing about this story would be what anyone expected. The photograph had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone white like old scars on skin that never quite healed. Ruth Mackenzie sat on cold asphalt beside an ATM machine at 2:17 in the morning, and she held that photograph the way a drowning person holds the last solid thing within reach. Not because it would save her, but because letting go meant admitting it was finally over. November 14th, 2022, mile marker 113, Highway 95, Nevada desert. The gas station had been abandoned long enough that the weeds growing through the cracked concrete had themselves died and been replaced by new ones. The fluorescent light above the ATM flickered in a slow, irregular pulse like a heartbeat that had forgotten its own rhythm. The cold came off the desert floor in waves, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, but reaches down into the marrow of things, into the spaces between your bones where warmth used to live. Ruth was 58 years old. She had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan. She had held men together with her bare hands in conditions that would have broken most people before they even understood what was happening. She had come home from war with a body that still worked and a mind that had learned slowly and at enormous cost to carry what it had seen without being entirely destroyed by the weight of it. She had survived all of that. She had not survived the last 3 years. The leather bracelet on her left wrist was the only piece of jewelry she still wore. The letters stamped into it had worn almost smooth, now rubbed down by years of unconscious touching, the way a person rubs a worry stone without realizing they're doing it. But she knew what the letters said. She would know until the last moment of her life. EMMA, her son's name, her son's bracelet, the only thing she had left of him. In the photograph, Emma was 19 years old, standing in front of the university he would never finish attending, squinting into autumn sunlight, with that particular grin of his, the one that started slow and then took over his entire face. The one that had been making Ruth feel like the world was fundamentally okay since he was 4 years old and had first learned to smile at her like that on purpose. He was tall, he had her dark eyes and his father's easy laugh, though his father had been gone since Emma was 6, and Ruth had never particularly mourned that departure. What she had never once considered in all the years of raising him alone was that she would have to mourn Emma. She had raised him through everything that raising a child alone involves: the fevers at 3 a.m., the school conferences, the years when money was thin, and she worked double shifts at the VA clinic and came home to find him asleep on the couch with a textbook open on his chest. And she would stand in the doorway for a longer time but just watching him breathe, because the breathing of a healthy child is one of those things you don't understand as a miracle until you've spent time around children who aren't breathing well. She had raised him through 2 deployments, the first when he was 9, and old enough to be frightened, but not old enough to fully articulate what frightened him, and the second when he was 14 and had developed the careful competence of a child who has learned to manage in a parent's absence without ever quite accepting that the absence is fair. She had come home from the 2nd deployment, and he had been 15, standing in the airport arrivals hall with a handmade sign that said "Mom" in letters too large for the paper, grinning, that slow-building grin at her over the top of it, and she had understood in that moment that whatever she had been through and whatever it had cost her, it had been worth it because this person existed. She pressed the photograph against her chest. "I'm sorry," she said to the empty desert. "I tried. I want you to know that. I tried for 3 years and I can't anymore, baby. I can't." The $18 in her jacket pocket was what remained of everything. She had spent the last of her money on gas to drive to this exact place, this cursed stretch of highway where the world had ended 3 years ago tonight. It had seemed important to come back here. It had seemed like the only thing that made sense to end it where it had ended, to close the circle at the place where everything that mattered had been taken away. She was going to walk into the desert. The November cold would do the rest. She had been a medic. She knew exactly how it would work. She had made her peace with it over 11 months of sleeping under bridges and in doorways and in the back of a truck she no longer owned. She had made her peace with it in the 100 shelters she had left before dawn, because the noise and the smell and the too close press of other people's desperate breathing made the thing inside her chest feel like it was going to tear free and take everything with it. She had made her peace with it on the long walk through the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself as grief, that just quietly removes everything from your life until you look around one day and realize there is nothing left to lose. The Iron Wolves had been her community for 6 years after her second deployment, 40 members who mostly understood what it meant to have come back from somewhere and found that the world you returned to didn't quite fit the shape of what you'd become. She had ridden with them through Nevada and California and into Oregon, and the motion had helped the way motion helps when stillness becomes unbearable. But after Emma died and the court gave Kyle Reeves a suspended sentence, and Senator Frank Reeves sat in the front row of the courtroom with his hand on his son's shoulder, Ruth had left the club and left the riding and left the last structure that had been holding her approximate shape. She started to stand. Her knees cracked. Her joints screamed their usual protest, though it was not morning and hadn't felt like morning in a very long time. And then she heard it, a child's voice, barely above a whisper, rising from somewhere below the ground, threading up through the metal grating, set into the asphalt at the base of the ATM machine, so faint that Ruth thought for a moment her mind had finally broken completely, that the 11 months of malnutrition and cold and grief had cracked something open that would not close again. She stood completely still. The voice came again. "Please help. It's dark. I can hear you breathing. Please don't leave." Ruth dropped back to her knees so fast the impact sent a shock of pain up through her legs that she didn't feel. She pressed her ear against the metal grating. Cold steel against her cheek. The hum of electronics from the ATM above. The thin whistle of desert wind through the old pump islands. And beneath all of it, crying, real crying. Young, exhausted, terrified crying that had been going on long enough that it had lost its urgency and become something more like a bodily function, something the child's lungs were doing because they didn't know how to stop. "Where are you?" Ruth's voice came out rough and strange, as though it had forgotten how to be used for anything other than asking strangers for spare change. "Under the ground. There's a room. There are 12 of us. They have us in cages." A pause, the sound of a small body pressing closer to the grating. "Please, they're coming back in an hour. They're going to take us somewhere and we'll never come back. Please." 12 children, in cages, under a gas station in the Nevada desert. Ruth's mind did not scramble for explanations or hesitate over the possibility that she was hallucinating. She had spent 2 tours making fast assessments in conditions that punished delay. Whatever had brought her here tonight, whatever she had planned to do when she walked away from this parking lot, was over now. The calculus had changed. It was that simple and that complete. She pressed her lips close to the grate. "How old are you?" 9. "What's your name?" A small hesitation. Then Clara. "Okay, Clara, I'm going to get you out. I need you to stay low and stay quiet. Can you do that?" Another pause, and then the girl said something that stopped Ruth's heart so completely that she physically rocked backward on her heels as though she'd been struck. "There was a girl here before you. Her name was Emma. She said that if I got really scared, I should say her name out loud. She said her mother was a soldier. She said soldiers always come when you call their name." The small voice cracked on the next words. "I've been saying it every night for 3 months. Every single night. Nobody came until now." Ruth Mackenzie had not cried since they put her son in the ground. She cried now. Not the kind of crying that provides relief, the other kind, the kind that tears loose from somewhere so deep that it bypasses the normal pathways entirely and just breaks through all at once, without warning, like a load-bearing wall giving way. She pressed her forehead against the grating and wept for Emma, for 3 years of darkness, for this child below the ground calling her son's name in the dark, for the terrible and inexplicable fact that she had come here tonight to do and instead was kneeling over a child who had been waiting specifically, impossibly, for someone exactly like her. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I hear you," she said. "I'm coming down." Behind the station, half buried under years of desert neglect and wind-blown debris, there was a service door. Ruth found it with the flashlight on her phone, 4% battery, and examined it for 3 seconds before picking up a chunk of broken concrete the size of her fist. The padlock was new. Whoever used this place had recently invested in securing it. That told her something about the level of organization she was dealing with. She filed that information away and started swinging. The first impact. Emma at 6 losing his first tooth and holding it up to show her eyes enormous with the wonder of his own body changing. The second impact. Emma at 12 reading on the couch while she cleaned her gear at the kitchen table, looking up every few pages to tell her something he'd just read, unable to keep the good parts to himself. The third. Emma at 19 standing in autumn sunlight outside a university building, grinning at her camera with that slow-building smile that made everything feel fundamentally okay. The fourth. Emma at 19 and a half, not standing anywhere. Not grinning, not reading, not telling her things he'd just learned. A hospital room. His hand in hers going cold. His last words so quiet she'd had to bend close to hear them. Nobody disappears in the dark alone, Mom. The padlock shattered on the fifth swing. Ruth pulled the door open. Concrete stairs descended into absolute blackness. The smell hit her immediately, mildew, sweat, fear, and something else underneath all of it that she recognized from her time in the field. The smell of a place where people had been kept for a longer time without adequate light or air or hope. The smell of suffering that had become routine. She checked her phone. 3% battery. The flashlight threw a pale cone of light that barely reached the bottom of the stairs. She went down anyway. 20 steps. 30. The stairwell was concrete on all sides, clearly reinforced, the walls smooth and deliberate. This had not been a basement that someone had repurposed. Someone had dug this space with intention, with planning, with the specific goal of creating somewhere that would never be found. The depth of it told her things she did not want to know about the scale of what she was walking into. At the bottom, a metal door with a wheel lock, the kind used on submarine hatches in industrial cold storage. Ruth gripped the wheel with both hands and turned it. The mechanism was well maintained. It moved smoothly without resistance. The door swung open, and Ruth Mackenzie saw what she would carry for the rest of her life. 12 children, ages 5 to 12 from what she could tell at a glance. In cages, actual cages, the kind used for large dogs, modified with padlocks and lined with thin blankets that had long since compressed into almost nothing on the bare concrete floors. A single bare bulb in the ceiling, buckets in the corners. 12 pairs of eyes turning toward the door, toward the light from her phone, the way plants turn toward sun, not with hope exactly, but with the last remaining instinct toward warmth, even when hope itself has been exhausted. The girl closest to the door was 9 years old. Red hair matted and unwashed, freckles scattered across her nose and cheekbones. Eyes that had seen too much darkness, but still held something in them. Something that had refused against all evidence and reason to go entirely out. "You came," she whispered. "I came," Ruth said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. Steadier than the rest of her. Because the part of Ruth Mackenzie that had been trained in field medicine, the part that had been built over 2 deployments into something that could function under conditions that stripped everything else away, had taken over. And when that part of her was running, it had always been able to hold the rest of her still. It was why she had been good at her job. It was why people had lived when statistically they should not have. She moved quickly through the room, assessing. Dehydration in all of them, visible in the dry lips and the slightly sunken quality of the younger children's eyes. Low-grade hypothermia in at least 3 of the smallest ones. Behavioral signs of prolonged stress. The silence of the older children. The flinching of the younger ones. The way none of them made sudden movements or loud sounds, even now. They had been trained out of it. She noted all of this and kept moving. She crossed to the safe in the corner. She had noticed it the moment she entered, a commercial floor safe, newer than anything else in the room, conspicuously well-maintained in a space that was otherwise deliberately decrepit. Ruth tried the keys she had taken from the guard's belt on her way to the safe. She would address the guard properly in a moment, and on the third key the lock clicked, open. Inside folders. Dozens of them. Ruth pulled them out and felt her stomach drop through the floor. Photographs of children, the ones behind her, and others, so many others. Names, dates, destinations, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, forged adoption papers, fake birth certificates, bank records referencing offshore accounts in amounts that made her vision blur for a moment, and in a separate folder sealed with red tape the names of the people who had made all of it possible. Sheriff Roy Briggs, 24 years in office, Nye County. Special Agent Dale Croft, FBI Missing Persons Task Force. Judge Warren Lyle, County Circuit Court. Senator Frank Reeves. Ruth photographed every page with her dying phone. 2% battery. She moved fast and methodically the way she had moved through field triage when there were too many injured and not enough time assessing, prioritizing, acting, not pausing to feel any of it yet. She stuffed the most critical folder inside her jacket, pressing it flat against her sternum where it would require deliberate searching to find. She had not forgotten the guard. He was large, 6'4", 250 pounds, dead eyes, and a spider tattoo that crawled from his collarbone up the side of his neck onto his jaw. He had appeared behind her when she was opening the third cage, moving quietly for a man his size, and had pressed a knife against her throat with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before and did not expect difficulty. His breath smelled like cigarettes and something sharper underneath. Ruth had not panicked. She had done what 18 months of Army training and 2 tours had made: instinctive, assessed his grip, identified the dominant hand, measured the angle of the blade, and waited for the half-second of hesitation that came when a large man underestimated a small woman. He had given her that half-second. She had taken his wrist, twisted sharply outward against the joint, stepped inside his reach, and brought her elbow up into his temple with the full rotation of her shoulders behind it. 250 pounds of muscle had collapsed without theater. Clara had stared at her through the bars. "You're not very big," the girl said. "Neither was the problem," Ruth said. She found the cage keys in the guard's jacket pocket. She started with Clara's cage. The lock clicked. The door swung open, and a 9-year-old girl who had been locked in darkness for 11 months stepped toward freedom on legs that were stiff and uncertain, blinking in the thin light of Ruth's phone as though she had forgotten what it felt like to move without permission. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just reached up and took Ruth's hand and held it with a grip so fierce and complete that Ruth felt something move in her chest, something that had been still for 3 years. Ruth stood in the bunker with 12 children and a dead phone and a folder full of evidence pressed against her ribs, and she breathed slowly and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to acknowledge what she had just seen and what it meant and what would happen next if she didn't move with extreme care. Then she looked at Clara. "We're going up. Stay close. Not a sound until I tell you we're clear." She led them up the stairs. 12 small bodies following single file, Clara at the front with her hand still wrapped around Ruth's. The night air hit them at the top of the stairs like something they had all forgotten existed, old and clean and vast after the compressed horror of the room below. Ruth guided the children away from the service door and behind the fallen wall of the pump island, putting concrete between them and the road. She listened. She counted seconds. She assessed the darkness in all directions with the practiced attention of someone who had spent years in environments where the failure to notice something could mean someone didn't make it to morning. She thought about what came next. The 911 call had gone through. She had given the location. Help was coming. All she had to do was wait. Clara pressed close against her side, the girl's shoulder warm against Ruth's ribs. Around them, the other children settled into a cluster, the older ones instinctively moving toward the younger ones, some small version of order emerging from the instinct to protect. Ruth looked up at the Nevada sky. The stars out here were extraordinary, the kind you forgot existed if you spent too long in cities thick and white and indifferent in the way that only very old things can be indifferent. She had looked at this same sky 11 months ago from under a bridge in Reno and thought that it was the most desolate thing she had ever seen. Looking at it now with Clara's hand in hers and 11 children breathing quietly beside her, it looked entirely different. Not desolate, enormous. Large enough to hold everything, the darkness and the children and the cold and the impossible fact that she was here rather than in the desert. 14 minutes. That was how long it took for the headlights to appear on the highway coming from the east, moving fast. 3 sets of headlights. Ruth felt the first thread of relief begin to move through her, followed immediately in the next second by the cold recognition that the vehicles turning into the gas station lot were not ambulances. 3 black SUVs, 6 deputies in tactical gear. And stepping out of the lead vehicle, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been untouchable for a very long time, and a man with gray hair and expensive cologne, and eyes that assessed the situation with the flat professional calm of something that had never needed to hurry because the outcome had always been predetermined. Sheriff Roy Briggs. He looked at the children. He looked at the open service door. He looked at Ruth. And he smiled. Well, he said, dispatch said a drifter found some kidnapped kids. He shook his head slowly, almost with regret. That's not what I see. He reached into Ruth's jacket pocket, the outer one, not the one against her skin, and produced a plastic bag of white powder that had absolutely not been there 10 minutes ago. What I see is a known drug addict who broke into private property and abducted 12 minors. He held up the bag. 3 ounces of heroin, resisting arrest. He smiled wider. That's 25 to life. The 6 deputies moved forward. Ruth fought. She was 58 years old and weighed 140 pounds and had not eaten a full meal in longer than she could precisely calculate. But she was also a combat-trained Army medic who had spent 2 tours in conditions that stripped everything unnecessary away and left only the core of what a person actually was when survival was the only option on the table. She broke one deputy's nose with the heel of her hand. She put another on the ground with a joint lock she had not used in years and was slightly surprised still worked perfectly. She made them work for every inch of it. There were 6 of them. They had batons and tasers and the full institutional weight of a corrupted system behind every action. In the end, it was simply mathematics. Ruth went down face first onto the asphalt, her cheek against the cold ground, her hands wrenched behind her back, the handcuffs biting into her wrists hard enough that she could feel the metal against bone, blood in her mouth from somewhere. The specific pain of a knee pressed into the small of her back by a man who outweighed her by 80 pounds. And worse, so much worse than anything being done to her body, the sound of children screaming as deputies loaded them back into a black van. Clara's voice cutting through all of it, high and desperate and specific. You promised, you said you'd help us, please. Ruth turned her head. Through the forest of boots and tactical legs, she could see the van's rear window. Clara's face pressed against the glass, both hands flat on the window, tears streaming down freckled cheeks. Briggs crouched beside Ruth. His lips came close to her ear. Tonight you hang yourself in your cell. By sunrise, these children are gone. And she was not going to come back. The irony of it was not lost on her. She had come here tonight intending exactly that outcome. And now faced with the specific concrete reality of it being arranged by someone else for their reasons rather than hers, she found that she did not want it. Not like this, not with Clara's face in that window and 12 children in that van and the folder full of names pressed against her ribs. Not yet, not until someone else knew. The patrol car turned onto the highway heading east. Through the rear window, the gas station shrank and disappeared. The desert stretched out in all directions, enormous and dark and absolute. Ruth pressed the bracelet against her wrist and felt Emma's name with her fingertips. I'm not done yet. 500 meters behind her in the direction the car had come from, Deputy Nate Hall sat in his patrol vehicle behind the collapsed wall of an abandoned warehouse and stared at the screen of his personal phone with hands that would not stop shaking. He was 26 years old. He had been on the force for 2 years because he had believed genuinely and perhaps naively that the badge meant something real, that the authority it represented was connected to something worth representing. He had just watched his sheriff plant evidence on a woman who had found kidnapped children. He had watched 6 deputies beat that woman into the asphalt. He had watched 12 screaming children be loaded into a van and driven away into the dark. His department-issued phone was in the dashboard holster, and he did not touch it. Every person he could call on that phone was either part of what he had just witnessed or supervised by someone who was. In his wallet behind his driver's license was a business card he had been carrying for 14 months. He had pulled over a motorcycle for a broken taillight on a routine evening shift, and the man who had stepped off the bike had been calm and cooperative and utterly without hostility, had accepted the warning without argument, and had handed Nate his card before riding away. Something about the man had stayed with him, a quality of steadiness, of someone who had been through things and come out the other side into a settled version of himself that Nate at 24 had found both foreign and compelling. The card read, Dax Mercer, Iron Wolves MC. Nate had kept it. He hadn't known why. Some part of him had apparently understood in the way that certain parts of us understand things before the rest catches up that a day like this would come, a day when every legitimate channel was compromised, when every sanctioned option had been captured, when the only move left was the kind that nobody in his training had ever suggested. He found the contact. He pressed call. 3 rings. The voice that answered was deep and rough, a man pulled from sleep and not pretending otherwise. Yeah, Nate's voice came out in pieces. The words fell over each other in his urgency to get them out before whatever small reservoir of nerve he had found ran dry. He told Dax Mercer about Ruth Mackenzie and the 12 children in the bunker beneath the gas station at mile marker 113. He told him about Sheriff Briggs and the planted drugs and the van heading west on I-15 and the flight departing at 6 in the morning from a private airfield outside Las Vegas. He told him about Agent Dale Croft and Judge Warren Lyle and Senator Frank Reeves and the folder full of names that the woman had stuffed inside her jacket before they took her. When he finished, he was crying. He hadn't noticed it happening until the back of his wrist came up against his eyes by reflex. I have no one else to call, he said. The whole department is compromised. The FBI field office is in it. There's a federal judge. I have nobody left on the list. He pressed his wrist harder against his eyes. Someone told me once that the Iron Wolves look after people who can't find help anywhere else. I didn't know who else to call. A silence. Not the silence of someone considering. The silence of someone who has already decided and is simply organizing. Where are you right now? Behind the old warehouse on Route 15, half a mile east of the gas station. They just pulled out. The sheriff took her east. The van with the children went west toward Vegas. Boss, stay exactly where you are. Don't call anyone else. Don't move. Don't go home. The line went dead. Nate Hall lowered his phone and looked out at the empty highway and the enormous dark desert beyond it, and thought about what he had just done, whether it was the bravest thing or the most foolish thing he had ever done, and whether in this particular situation there was any meaningful difference between the two. He had no way of knowing that 500 meters to the west, the woman in the back of that patrol car was pressing a bracelet against her wrist and refusing for the first time in 3 years to be finished. He had no way of knowing that the man he had just called was already out of bed and moving, already dialing, already setting in motion, something that 173 people would fuel with their engines and their love and their absolute refusal to let a woman who had once saved a brother be left alone in the dark. He had no way of knowing any of that. He just sat with his shaking hands and his personal phone and the terrible weight of having done the only right thing available to him, and he waited to find out if it would be enough. The desert held everything in its silence, the van moving west, the patrol car moving east, the gas station with its broken padlock and open service door, and the bunker below that still smelled of children who had been kept in darkness far too long. And somewhere above it all, indifferent and extraordinary, the Nevada stars, the same ones Emma Mackenzie had once looked up at from a university parking lot and called the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Nobody disappears in the dark alone. He had said it to his mother in a hospital room 3 years ago tonight. Tonight, without knowing it, he had made it come true. The clubhouse of the Iron Wolves Nevada chapter occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse on the eastern edge of Reno above a motorcycle repair shop that smelled permanently of engine oil and burnt metal and the honest labor of men who worked with their hands because they needed something real to hold on to. The stairs were steel, open-framed, loud enough that anyone climbing them announced their arrival whether they wanted to or not. The room at the top was large and low-ceilinged and scarred by years of use, a long wooden table down the center that had witnessed more hard conversations than most courtrooms, walls hung with photographs and patches, and the accumulated evidence of a brotherhood that had built itself out of the wreckage of men who had come home from wars and found that the world they returned to did not quite fit the shape of what they had become. Dax Mercer was out of bed before the call ended. He dressed in the dark the way he had dressed for operations without thought, without wasted motion, the muscle memory of a man who had spent years in conditions where the speed of preparation was the difference between outcomes. Black jeans, boots laced tight. The vest last settled across his shoulders with the ease of something worn so often it had become a second skin, sleeveless black leather, heavy with patches, and the red emblem badge on the chest that meant something specific to everyone in 4 states who knew what it meant. He was 49 years old. The shaved sides of his hair had gone fully gray in the last 2 years. The beard thick and white and reaching his chest made him look in certain lights like someone from an older time, a blacksmith maybe, or a man who built things with stone and expected them to last. The sleeve tattoos covering both arms from wrist to shoulder, dense Celtic knotwork interlaced with tribal patterns accumulated over 3 decades told a different story if you knew how to read them. Most people didn't. They just saw the size of him and the ink and the beard and the vest and made their calculations accordingly. Those calculations were usually wrong in the way that mattered most. Dax Mercer was not a bottom-up man. He was a man who had seen enough violence to understand exactly what it cost, and who spent considerable energy ensuring that the people around him never paid that cost unnecessarily. He had built Iron Wolves Nevada into what it was: 39 members, a reputation for steadiness, a set of internal expectations stricter than most people assumed, precisely because he believed that the difference between a brotherhood and a gang was the degree to which the men in it had consciously chosen what they were. He made 3 calls in 90 seconds. The first 2 were straightforward. Iron Wolves Reno Ratchet, his sergeant-at-arms, answered on the second ring, always regardless of the hour, because that was who Ratchet was and had been for 11 years of standing at Dax's right shoulder. Desert Hammers Phoenix, their president, Cord Whitfield, who had ridden with Dax through things that predated their clubs and their patches and everything else, answered before the first ring finished. Both conversations were short. Both men asked 0 unnecessary questions. The third call was the one that required something different from him. Victor Greer answered on the 4th ring with the tone of a man who had looked at the caller ID and was deciding in real time how hostile to be about it. Victor Stone Greer was 47 years old and had been president of Mongrel Brotherhood Los Angeles for 11 years. He was 6'2", 220 pounds of organized restraint with a shaved head and a jaw that looked as though it had been assembled from something geological and then left to weather. He and Dax had not spoken in 7 years. The last time they had occupied the same physical space, 2 men had died, one from each side, and the conversation that followed had been brief and final, and had ended with a mutual understanding that the distance between them was the only thing keeping the situation from becoming permanent. Dax did not apologize. He did not reference the history. He said 12 children, van on I-15 heading west, plane at 6 a.m., these kids don't make that flight, they're gone forever. UN, 4 seconds of silence. In those 4 seconds, Dax heard something move through the line, not sound, but the absence of the response he had expected. The hostility he had braced for wasn't there. Something had shifted in the quality of Victor's silence, turning it from the silence of a man who is deciding whether to be angry into the silence of a man who is deciding how fast he can move. "We're already moving," Victor said. The line went dead. Dax stood for a moment in the dark of his room, holding the phone, thinking about those 4 seconds. Then he went downstairs to wake his brothers. Within 40 minutes, the Iron Wolves clubhouse was full. 39 men, some pulled from sleep 20 minutes earlier, some who had driven at distances that should have taken twice as long, filling the long wooden table and the space around it with the compressed energy of people who understood that something real was happening and had come to find out what it required of them. They ranged in age from 22 to 64. They were mechanics and veterans and contractors, and 3 who had served time and come out the other side into something that held them. Collectively, they were the kind of men that polite society wrote off as a problem and then called when it needed something fixed that the official channels couldn't reach. Dax stood at the head of the table and did not waste time. He told them about Ruth McKenzie, about the bunker, about the 12 children, about Sheriff Briggs and the planted evidence, and the van heading toward a private airfield outside Las Vegas. He told them about the folder, the names, the amounts, the destinations. He told them that the FBI field office was compromised, that the local judiciary was compromised, and that the woman who had found all of this was currently in the back of a patrol car being driven east on Highway 95 by men who had been ordered to ensure she did not arrive anywhere. Then he pulled out his phone and showed them the photograph. Ruth had uploaded it to 3 cloud servers before her battery died. Nate Hall had a contact who had pulled the files and mirrored them across every server he could reach in the 40 minutes since the call. The image was grainy and dark, taken in haste with a dying phone, in a room lit by a single bare bulb. but it was clear enough. 12 children in cages. The room went absolutely silent. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, the silence of people who are containing something very large in a very small space and holding it there with the conscious application of will because the alternative to containing it is not useful right now, and they know it. Ratchet Sergeant-at-Arms built like a fire hydrant with a face that had absorbed considerable punishment over the years and rearranged itself around the experience into something that communicated both history and absolute reliability, was the first to speak. He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when he has made a decision that does not require discussion. "I'm in." One by one around the table, every man rose. Dax looked at them. "This is war with law enforcement. This is war with corrupt law enforcement," said a man named Brixton, who had 3 daughters and had been the quietest person in the room until this moment. "There's a difference. Anyone who can't see that difference, the door's right there." Nobody moved toward the door. "Desert Hammers are meeting us at the junction in 90 minutes, Dax said. "Mongrel Brotherhood is coming up on I-15. We will have somewhere between 150 and 200 bikes on Highway 95 before the sun comes up." He paused. "Tonight there are no clubs, no territories, no old business between anyone in this room or anyone who's going to meet us on that road. There is one thing and one thing only." He looked at the photograph on his phone. "We ride." Ratchet pulled on his jacket. Something moved across his face, not humor exactly, but the thing adjacent to it that appears when a man has decided that if the situation is going to be what it is, he might as well acknowledge the absurdity of certain aspects of it rather than let them sit unexamined. "Mongrel Brotherhood is coming," he said. "Victor Greer is going to be standing next to me in an hour." "Yes. I have a conversation I've been meaning to have with that man since 2011. "Not tonight." Ratchet nodded slowly. "I know. A beat. I just want you to be aware that I'm exercising a considerable amount of restraint, and I'd appreciate it being noted." "Noted," Dax said. "Let's ride." In the back of the patrol car heading east on Highway 95, Ruth Mackenzie was not waiting. Waiting was not something her body knew how to do when a situation was active. She had been in the back of vehicles under constraint before, not under these circumstances, but she understood the geometry of the position, the physics of what was and was not possible with hands cuffed behind your back in a moving vehicle. She understood it the way she understood most physical problems, methodically, from first principles, without panic, because panic was a luxury that actively degraded performance. The folder was still against her sternum. They had searched her outer pockets and found what Briggs had planted. They had not searched beneath her jacket because they had not expected her to have concealed anything there, and because the deputies managing her arrest had been focused on control rather than thoroughness. She had noted this without expression at the time and filed it away. She listened to the radio. Most of what she heard was procedural call signs and position updates in the encoded language of a department that believed its communications were secure. But at 3:14 a.m., she heard something that was not procedural and that changed the calculations completely. One of the deputies in the front seat, the one holding the radio handset, said quietly, "Copy that. The woman doesn't make it to booking. Natural causes." "Understood." The deputy riding shotgun didn't respond verbally. He just nodded once and looked out his window at the passing desert. Ruth absorbed this. She had known it was a possibility from the moment Briggs leaned down and whispered in her ear in the parking lot. But knowing something is possible and hearing the flat administrative confirmation of it are two different experiences. The latter has a weight that the former does not, a finality, a bureaucratic matter-of-factness that is somehow colder than anger would be. She pressed the bracelet against the seat behind her. "I'm not done yet." The vehicle was moving at approximately 60 miles per hour on a road with no shoulders worth noting. Her hands were cuffed behind her at standard distance. The partition between the rear compartment and the front seats was polycarbonate, not steel, which meant certain things about force and an angle. The door locks were engaged from the front, but the mechanism was accessible from the rear if you knew where to reach and had hands capable of functioning under constraint. She had hands capable of functioning under most things. She began to work. Nearly 300 miles to the south on the I-15 heading north, 64 motorcycles moved through the pre-dawn dark in a formation that other drivers instinctively gave room to, Not because anyone told them to, but because there are things in this world that announce their own nature clearly enough that the appropriate response is immediately apparent. Victor Stone Greer wrote at the front of the Mongrel Brotherhood column, with the stillness of a man who has resolved something internally and is now simply executing against it. He was not given to visible emotion. The men who had ridden with him for 11 years had learned to read the small signals, the set of his jaw, the angle at which he held his shoulders, the texture of his silence. And what they read tonight was something they had not seen from him in a long time. This was not anger. Anger was familiar. It had a heat and an urgency and a forward lean that they recognized. This was something colder and more absolute. 8 months ago, a 7-year-old girl named Gracie Holbrook had disappeared from a park in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles. Her father, Marcus Holbrook, had been a Mongrel Brotherhood member for 6 years. A good man, a careful man, the kind who brought his daughter to club cookouts and taught her to identify every make and model of motorcycle in the lot, because she found it hilarious how seriously the men took their bikes. Gracie had been missing for 8 months. The LAPD had exhausted their leads in 6 weeks. Victor had spent his own money called in favors across 4 states and had gone over the same fragmentary information in the same order, more times than he could count, hoping to find the thing he had missed. He had found nothing. The trail had gone cold in the gradual, complete way that missing children cases go cold, not dramatically, just thoroughly, until the file sat in a drawer. And Marcus came to meetings and sat in the back without speaking, and Victor had nothing to give him. When Dax had called and said 12 children in a bunker on Highway 95 and an underground network with a folder full of names and a flight at 6 in the morning, Victor had been out of bed before he fully understood what he was agreeing to. Because if there was a network, there were records. And if there were records, there was a chance. He rode north through the Nevada dark and did not allow himself to think too specifically about what finding those records might mean or what not finding them would mean, because either possibility was too large to hold while also needing to function. He had learned that discipline in other contexts. It applied here. Somewhere ahead, a woman he had never met was in the back of a car being driven toward her death because she had done the right thing. That was sufficient reason. At 4:47 in the morning at a junction 14 miles east of mile marker, 173 motorcycles gathered, 39 Iron Wolves from Reno, 46 Desert Hammers from Phoenix, 64 Mongrel Brotherhood from Los Angeles, 24 independent riders who had heard through the fast-traveling network of people who communicate outside official channels and who had come because some things require no explanation beyond the basic facts. They had come from different directions and different histories and different decades of decisions that had put them on this road tonight, rather than some other road. They had real wounds between them, not metaphorical ones. There were men in this gathering who had reason to not stand next to certain other men. There were histories here that ran deep and did not resolve cleanly. None of that was present tonight. What was present was the concrete fact of 173 people who had gotten out of bed in the middle of the night and ridden through the Nevada desert because children were in cages and a woman who had found them was being driven toward her death. And because some things are larger than old grievances, and some nights make that undeniable. Dax and Victor stood 10 feet apart at the head of the assembly and looked at each other across the distance in the 7 years and everything that lived inside them. Victor spoke first. "We get the kids out. We get the woman out. Everything else waits." "Agreed," Dax said. It was the longest conversation they had managed in 7 years. They rode. The sound of 173 motorcycle engines opening up simultaneously on an empty Nevada highway at 4:47 in the morning is not a sound that has an adequate comparison. It is not like thunder exactly, though it shares certain qualities with it. It is more total than thunder, more sustained, more intentional sound that the landscape receives and holds and reflects back from the rock faces and the dry creek beds and the empty distance in waves so that it seems to come from everywhere at once rather than from any single source. It is the sound of something that has decided. They poured over the eastern ridge in a single flowing column that split into 4 as it descended, spreading to cover all approach routes to the gas stations simultaneously. The headlights turned the darkness into something close to daylight. The sound arrived before the lights, rolling ahead like a warning that was also for the children in that van, 47 miles west, a promise. Sheriff Roy Briggs was overseeing the final stages of the cleanup operation at mile marker 113 when his radio crackled. "Sheriff, we've got there are motorcycles coming. From the east, a lot of them." Briggs frowned. "Define a lot." "Sir, I can't count them. They're still coming over the ridge. I've got at least 100, maybe more. Moving fast." The smugness that had settled over Briggs after the arrest, the satisfaction of a man who had managed a crisis successfully and was already composing the version of events he would tell, evaporated in the time it took to process those words. He knew about Iron Wolves. He knew about their connection to the woman he had arrested, but they were based in Reno, 5 hours away, under normal circumstances, and it had been less than 2 hours since the takedown. There was no way they had mobilized this quickly unless someone had made a call in the first minutes. He thought about Deputy Nate Hall, the young one, the one who asked too many questions. His radio crackled again. "Sheriff, they're coming from 3 directions now. I count—" A pause, the deputy's voice losing the last of its professional composure. "Sir, there are a lot of them." The first motorcycle crested the eastern ridge, then the second, then in a wave that did not stop the rest. They surrounded the gas station from all 4 compass points, blocking every exit route with a precision that spoke to coordination Briggs had not anticipated and did not know how to counter. The headlights of 173 bikes turned the abandoned gas station lot into something approaching noon. The engine noise was physical, a presence that pressed against the chest and made ordinary thought require effort. Then in sequence, the engines cut. The silence that followed was somehow louder than the noise had been. Dax Mercer dismounted. He walked forward through the still settling dust, unhurried, and stopped 10 feet from Roy Briggs. He looked at the sheriff the way a man looks at something he has fully assessed and found fundamentally wanting, not with rage, not with performance, but with the calm of someone who has already determined the outcome and is simply completing the necessary steps. "Evening, Sheriff," Dax said. "This is a crime scene." Briggs's voice had the texture of a man drawing hard on 24 years of practiced authority. "You're interfering with an act of law enforcement. Where are the children?" Not a question. The absence of any interrogative inflection made it something else entirely, a statement of what was going to happen, phrased in the form of a sentence. "There are no children here. What you think you—" Dax held up his phone. The photograph. 12 children in cages taken by a woman with a dying phone in a bunker 30 feet below where they were standing. "Already mirrored across every server my tech guy could reach in the last 2 hours," Dax said. "He's thorough." He lowered the phone. "Where are the children?" Briggs looked at the photograph. His face did something complicated, the practiced calm of 2 decades of corrupt authority encountering for the first time the specific situation it had no protocol for. The moment when the infrastructure of a long lie meets the one thing it was never built to withstand. "Your vagrant is a known drug." "Wrong answer." Dax's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "We know about the bunker. We know about Croft. We know about Lyle. We know about Senator Reeves. We know about the $75,000 per child. We know about the flight." He let that sit for 3 seconds. "One question, federal prison for the rest of your life. Or do you want to take your chances with the 173 people standing behind me who don't particularly believe in the judicial system right now?" Briggs's hand moved toward his sidearm. 173 hands moved in response. The movement was not choreographed, it was not theatrical. It was the instinctive collective response of people who had been watching a specific gesture and were prepared for it the same way a flock of birds turns as one, without any detectable signal, because they have been paying attention, and some things require no coordination to coordinate. "I wouldn't," Dax said quietly. Briggs's hand stopped. Near the back of the assembled formation, Taylor Mack, 22 years old, Ratchet's nephew, possessing both the courage and the particular recklessness of someone that age, who has grown up around men who take things seriously, held up an iPhone with a red recording light blinking in the dark. 18 million people right now, Sheriff, Tyler said. Numbers going up fast. 18 million. The number arrived on Briggs the way large numbers arrive on people who have spent decades operating in darkness, with a vertiginous unreality, the sensation of ground that had seemed solid revealing itself to have always been something else. He had built his operation on the assumption of invisibility, the assumption that what happened out here stayed out here, the assumption that the night could swallow things permanently. He reached for his radio. His hands were shaking. All units. His voice had lost something it would not get back. The prisoner Mackenzie. Bring her back to mile marker 113. A pause. The radio crackled. The van. Tell them to turn it around. Static. Then a response from a deputy who had spent the drive west doing his own arithmetic about what he was hearing on the radio and what it meant for his future. Copy, we're already turning around. On I-15, 47 miles west of mile marker 113, a black van executed a three-point turn on the highway shoulder and began moving east. In the back of that van, Clara Dawson felt the change in direction before she understood what it meant. She felt the deceleration, the brief stop, the swing of momentum as the vehicle turned. She pressed her face against the mesh barriers separating the cargo area from the front seats and watched the two deputies through it and understood from the set of their shoulders, in the silence between them, that something had changed, that the night had shifted in some way she couldn't yet name but could feel. She closed her eyes. She pressed her hands together in her lap. She whispered the name that had been her anchor for 11 months in a bunker where she had learned that the distance between surviving and not surviving was often just this, having something to hold on to when everything else was dark. Emma, she whispered, send her back. Please send her back. The patrol car carrying Ruth reached mile marker 113 23 minutes after Briggs's radio order. The two deputies in the front had received the transmission in silence. They had exchanged one look and then spent the remainder of the drive staring at the road ahead with the expressions of men rapidly revising their assessment of every decision they had made in the last 4 years. The door opened. Ruth stepped out. She had not freed herself from the cuffs during the drive. The mechanism had been more resistant than she had calculated, and she had stopped working on it when she determined that continuing would risk a wrist fracture she couldn't afford. But she had spent the drive thinking, organizing, mapping the variables in their relationships in the order in which they needed to be addressed. By the time the car stopped, she had a clear picture of what the situation required. She stood in the glare of 173 headlights, with her hands still cuffed behind her back. Blood dried on her face, one eye swelling toward closed, and she looked across the gathered assembly with the assessment of a woman who had operated in complex environments and could read a scene in a single scan. Then she saw Clara. The van had arrived 2 minutes earlier. The rear doors had been opened by Ratchet, and 3 others and 12 children had been helped out into the cold pre-dawn air, and the extraordinary brightness of the assembled headlights, blinking and uncertain, as their eyes adjusted to the light, and their minds struggled with the reality of open air and the absence of cage doors. Clara had not waited for her eyes to adjust. She had heard the patrol car pull up. She had turned toward it. And when the door opened and Ruth stepped out, something happened in the girl's face that was not quite hope. Hope had been rationed for too long to arrive all at once, but was the moment before hope. The recognition that hope might be allowed back in, that the door to it was open and the thing itself was possible again. She ran. Ruth saw her coming. She went to her knees on the asphalt, and Clara hit her like a small storm, arms around Ruth's neck, face buried in Ruth's jacket, crying and saying her name over and over in a voice that had not said anyone's name, with relief in 11 months, and had forgotten how much relief could hurt. You came back. You came back. You came back. Ruth could not hold her with cuffed hands. She bent forward and pressed her cheek against the red hair and breathed. I told you, Ruth said. I wouldn't leave. Dax came forward with a key taken from one of the disarmed deputies. He crouched behind Ruth and worked the cuffs open. They fell away. Ruth brought her arms around and held Clara properly, not gently, not with the managed tenderness of someone performing comfort, but with the full force of a woman who had been told tonight that a child had called her son's name in the dark for 3 months and had never stopped believing. The other 11 children moved toward them in ones and twos, reaching out to touch Ruth's shoulder or arm or jacket, confirming the reality of her. Some were crying, some were past crying, and had arrived at a stillness that was its own kind of statement about what they had endured. One small boy, who could not have been older than 6, sat down cross-legged on the asphalt beside Ruth's knee and leaned his head against her leg and said nothing at all. Around them, 173 men stood in the Nevada pre-dawn and witnessed this. Some of them looked away, not from indifference, from the opposite of indifference. Dax stood back and watched his brothers, men he had ridden beside for years, men whose capacity for hardness he understood completely, pulling water bottles and protein bars and emergency blankets from saddlebags and moving among the children with a gentleness that was entirely genuine. Victor Greer had crouched in front of a small girl who was shaking very badly and was speaking to her in a low, steady voice, his enormous hands folded in his lap, waiting for the shaking to slow. Ratchet, who had said in 2011 that he didn't understand children and preferred to keep it that way, was sitting on the ground with two of the younger ones on either side of him, and one of them had fallen asleep against his arm. And then the three deputies, who had nothing left to lose, made their decision. It happened fast, the way these things always happen, faster than the anticipation of it, faster than the response time of people who had allowed themselves for a few minutes to believe the worst was behind them. Three men with backup weapons. Three men whose names were on the folder, whose roads led to federal prison, regardless of what happened tonight. Three men running the arithmetic of their situation and arriving at the only answer the arithmetic would produce when the only currency left is desperation. The first shot was panic fire, a body acting before a mind finished its calculation. But the second shot was aimed, and it was aimed at the van window, and Clara was near the van, and Ruth saw it in the half second before it happened, with the cold, specific clarity of someone who has spent years in environments where the half second before is the only moment that matters. She did not think. The soldier in her, the medic, who had spent years moving toward the people in danger, rather than away from them, because that was the only way to do the work, simply moved. Ruth launched herself across the lot. Her ribs protested, her legs burned. Every nerve ending reported the impossibility of what she was demanding from a body that had been beaten and handcuffed and gone without proper food for 11 months. She demanded it anyway. She hit the deputy at the exact moment of the second shot. They went down together onto the asphalt hard. The gun discharged. The bullet that had been aimed at the window where Clara's face was pressed went elsewhere into the back of Ruth's left shoulder, through the muscle above the scapula, exiting clean on the other side. Ruth hit the ground and did not get up. The shot produced its own silence, the silence that follows a sharp sound when everyone who heard it is trying to understand what it means. Then everything happened at once, the remaining deputies taken down by a response that was immediate in absolute voices calling coordinates. The distinct sound of Dax's voice cutting through everything else with a precision that required no volume to carry authority. Patch, get to her now. Doc Garner was already moving. He had been a combat medic for 11 years before he became the Iron Wolves medical officer, and he carried his kit with the reflexive completeness of a man who had learned at cost that the situation where you need something is never the situation where you expected to need it. He crossed the lot at a run and dropped to his knees beside Ruth and put two fingers to her neck and looked up at Dax. No pulse. Clara had seen it happen. She was at the van window, both hands pressed flat against the glass, her face a single sustained expression of refusal, refusing to accept what she was seeing, refusing to allow it, refusing with the totality of a child who has spent 11 months refusing to stop believing. "Don't go," she said. "You promised. Don't go." Doc laced his fingers together, placed his palms on Ruth's sternum, and began. He counted aloud. The count carried across the still lot with a clarity that turned it into something beyond a medical procedure. 1 second, 2 seconds. The way a room counts with a clock when the outcome is genuinely uncertain. The way people breathe together without deciding to, because the moment requires it. Dax stood at Ruth's feet and watched his brother's hands working and did not look away. Victor Greer stood 6 feet back. His face held the look of a man who had spent a long time perfecting the art of not showing what he felt and who was in this specific moment no longer trying. Nate Hall stood at the edge of the assembly where he had been standing since driving back to the location 40 minutes after his call, and he watched the woman he had called a stranger to help being worked on by a stranger's hands, surrounded by strangers who had ridden hundreds of miles in the dark because he had found a business card in his wallet and made one phone call to the right person. The count reached 20, 30. Clara's lips moved against the glass. The same word over and over, the name of a boy who had died 3 years ago tonight on this exact road, whose last words to his mother had traveled through an underground room to a 9-year-old girl who had been sending them back into the world every night for 3 months, waiting for someone to receive them. 40, 45. Doc's arms burned. His rhythm did not falter. 20 years of training and 11 years of application had produced in him the capacity to keep doing the necessary thing past the point where the body wants to stop, to keep the motion clean and the pressure correct, and the count accurate when the part of his mind that was not purely technical was saying things he refused to listen to. 47. The number arrived with the weight of what it represented. 1 second for each child taken. 47 children. 47 seconds. The universe keeping a ledger in the only currency that cannot be forged. 48. Ruth Mackenzie gasped. Her chest heaved against Doc's hands. Her back arched against the asphalt. Her eyes opened, both of them, the swollen one and the clear one, and she pulled air into her lungs with the raw urgency of a body that had been reminded at the most fundamental level that it was not finished. Doc sat back on his heels. His hands were shaking for the first time in 20 years of this work. He made no effort to hide it. "Welcome back, Sergeant," he said. Ruth's voice came out in pieces, rough and barely there. "Still not a sergeant." "Tonight you are." Ruth turned her head. Clara was still at the van window, both hands still pressed flat against the glass, tears running down her face without sound, the kind of crying that happens when the body has exhausted every other way of expressing something that has no adequate expression. Ruth raised her right hand, the one not attached to the shoulder with a bullet in it, and pressed her palm flat against the outside of the window. Clara pressed her palm against the inside. Their hands met through the glass, aligned perfectly. The way they had met once before through a metal grate in a dark room beneath the Nevada desert, when a woman had reached toward a voice and a child had reached toward a name, and something had passed between them that no one watching from outside could have named, but everyone present could feel. The Nevada sky was beginning to change at its eastern edge, not light yet, but the first weakening of the deepest dark. The desert held the cold with the tenacity of a place that has learned not to expect warmth and does not easily give up what it has held all night. Somewhere in the middle distance, the sound of helicopters. News vans converging from 3 directions following a signal that had been broadcasting to 20 million people for 40 minutes. And somewhere above it all, indifferent and extraordinary, the last of the Nevada stars doing what stars do, burning at distances too large to comprehend for reasons that have nothing to do with the small, urgent lives below them, and shining down anyway on a gas station parking lot where a woman had come to disappear and had instead become something she would spend the rest of her life learning the full shape of. Ruth kept her hand against the glass. Clara kept hers there too. And in the gathering pre-dawn, with 173 men standing in witness and 12 children blinking in the light and the sound of helicopters growing in the east, the bracelet on Ruth's wrist caught the first pale edge of morning, and the name stamped into it was briefly clearly visible. Emma. 5 letters, worn almost smooth. Still there. The count was still running in Doc Garner's head. That was the thing about numbers learned under pressure. They did not simply stop when the situation that required them ended. They kept going, kept marking time, kept insisting on their own completion, the way a song insists on its final chord even after the room has fallen silent. He sat back on his heels beside Ruth in the parking lot, and his hands were still shaking, and the count was still running, and he let it run until it reached the number that felt like an ending. He counted to 47. Then he stopped. He had been a combat medic for 11 years. He had worked on people in conditions that the word difficult failed completely to describe. He had made the decision more than once to stop and move to the next person, because that was what the mathematics of field triage sometimes required. He had made peace with those decisions, mostly in the way you make peace with things done under conditions that left no good options, imperfectly, gradually, and never entirely. He had never made peace with the idea of losing someone in a parking lot in Nevada because 3 corrupt deputies decided that shooting their way out was better than what waited for them in a courtroom. Ruth was breathing. She was breathing badly, shallow and effortful, the left side of her chest compensating for a shoulder wound that had involved more than just the muscle, but she was breathing, and her pulse under his fingers was present and strengthening, and the quality of her eyes when they opened told him that the person behind them was still organized, still functional, and extremely unhappy about her current position on the ground. "Don't move," he told her. "I need to see. You need to not move." The bullet went through clean above the scapula, but you have a pneumothorax developing on the left side, and if you stand up right now, you're going to collapse it completely, and I'm going to have to put a needle in your chest in a parking lot at 5 in the morning, and neither of us wants that." Ruth looked at him with the expression of a woman taking stock. "You were a medic," she said. 11 years. "Then you know I'm going to move anyway." "I know, I'm asking you to wait 3 minutes first." She waited 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, the world reorganized itself around her with the focused urgency of a situation that has been holding its breath and finally received permission to exhale. The three deputies who had fired were on the ground restrained, stripped of their weapons with an efficiency that spoke to the capability of people who knew exactly how these things were done. Briggs stood 20 feet away with his wrists zip-tied behind him and his face doing something that 24 years of maintained authority had not prepared it to do, collapsing inward, the entire scaffolding of a long, carefully constructed lie, finally meeting the load it could not support. Agent Dale Croft was at this moment at Gate 14 of McCarran International Airport, sweating through a suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, holding a boarding pass for a flight to Cancun that connected through Houston. He had a bag with a change of clothes, a passport with specific stamps, and an account number in the Cayman Islands that he had been quietly building for 3 years. His phone was face down in his lap because what he didn't know couldn't alter the gate agent's schedule. What he didn't know was that his name was in a folder that had been photographed with a 1% battery in a bunker 30 feet underground, that the folder was pressed against a woman's sternum in the parking lot at mile marker 113, and that 12 black SUVs had left the FBI's Washington field office 47 minutes ago, carrying people who had not been compromised. He found out about all of it when two agents sat down on either side of him at Gate 14 and showed him their credentials, and the boarding pass fell out of his hand and drifted to the floor of the terminal, and nobody picked it up. At mile marker 113, 12 black SUVs arrived at 5:47 in the morning. The woman who stepped out of the lead vehicle was 53 years old, with close-cropped silver hair, in the bearing of someone who had spent 2 decades doing difficult work in difficult places, without losing the capacity to look directly at what the work cost. Assistant Director Patricia Hale had built her career dismantling trafficking networks across 4 continents. She had seen the live stream at 4:22 a.m., been on the phone with the deputy director by 4:31, and been moving toward a helicopter by 4:38. She took one look at the assembled scene, the bikers, the children in emergency blankets, Briggs on his knees, Ruth on the ground, with Doc Garner's hands at her shoulder, and began issuing orders with the measured efficiency of a person who understands that the most valuable thing authority can do in a resolved crisis is stop the bleeding and begin the documentation. Every deputy in custody, full statements from all witnesses, children into protective services within the hour. Briggs in federal detention before sunrise. She turned to the agent at her shoulder. "Croft McCarran, they have him at the gate." "Good." She crossed to Ruth and crouched beside her. She looked at the wound at Doc's work at Ruth's face. "You're Mackenzie." "Yes." "The folder you took from the safe." Ruth reached inside her jacket with her good arm and produced it, creased from 3 hours pressed against her body, slightly damp at the edges but intact. Every page present, every name legible. Hale took it. She held it in both hands for a moment without opening it, with the expression of someone who has been working toward a specific outcome for a very long time and is now holding the physical proof that the outcome is real. 23 arrests, she said quietly. This gives us 23 arrests across 4 states. She looked at Ruth steadily. The folder lists 47 children over 3 years. How many were in the bunker? 12 nifas. The others we've been building parallel cases through other channels, but this folder gives us the documentation to move on all of them simultaneously. She paused. 31 confirmed locations as of 2 hours ago. We have active operations on the remaining 16. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Will you get them back? With this, Hale looked at the folder the most of them. It's going to take time. Some of it will be very hard, but most of them. She met Ruth's eyes. Prague was cleared 40 hours ago. Budapest 42 hours ago. We have people on the ground in 3 other countries. Doc put his hand on Ruth's good shoulder. Hospital. I mean it this time. Ruth held up one finger. 1 minute. She pushed herself to sitting. Doc made a sound that was not quite a word and looked across the parking lot to where Sheriff Roy Briggs was kneeling on the asphalt with his hands zip-tied behind him and his face turned toward the ground. 24 years, a network that had moved 47 children across the world and replaced them with money and the confidence of a man who had never once been made to feel the weight of what he was doing. Clara was walking toward him. The crowd parted. It happened without anyone deciding it should. The bikers and the federal agents and the two news crews who had arrived in the last few minutes all simply stepped back, creating a corridor through which a 9-year-old girl with red hair and an emergency blanket around her shoulders walked toward the man who had tried to pee her. Her feet were steady. Her chin was level. Her eyes held what comes after darkness when a person has been in it long enough and chosen to come out the other side, not the absence of darkness, but the knowledge of what it is and what it can and what it cannot ultimately take. She stopped 3 feet in front of Briggs. He did not look up. "You told us nobody was looking," Clara Cooter said. Her voice was small, but it carried in the pre-dawn stillness with the clarity of something that has been held inside for a long time and is finally fully said. "You told us we were nothing, that we'd disappear and nobody would ever know." Briggs's shoulders began to shake. "You were wrong." She leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and every camera in the lot caught it, and 24 million people heard it as clearly as if she had been speaking to each of them alone. They came from everywhere, every direction. And now you sit in the dark by yourself, just like we did. Except nobody is coming for you. Not ever. She straightened. She turned around. She walked away from him. Roy Briggs pressed his forehead against the asphalt of the parking lot he had owned for 24 years, and the sound he made was the sound of a structure finally meeting the force it was never designed to withstand. Not dramatic, not violent, just complete. The sound of something that had been holding for a long time releasing all at once. Clara walked straight back to Ruth and sat down beside her on the ground and took Ruth's good hand in both of hers and leaned her head against Ruth's arm. Ruth said nothing. Around them, the desert was beginning to receive the first gray suggestion of dawn, and in it, the gas station and the gathered assembly and the 12 children in their emergency blankets all held the quality of something emerging from darkness rather than disappearing into it. They sat there for a long moment, the woman and the girl in the middle of 173 men and federal agents and news cameras, and the Nevada morning arriving slowly from the east. "Can we go home now?" Clara asked quietly. "I want to see my mom." Ruth looked at Dax, who was standing 6 feet away watching her with the expression of a man who has something important to say and is choosing his moment carefully. He nodded once. "Yes, sweetheart," Ruth said. "Let's get you home." Sandra Dawson had been asleep on her sister's couch in Reno, the kind of sleep that is not really sleep, that happens in thin, uncertain layers, that the awareness of an absent child can always reach through, when her phone began vibrating with more notifications than its normal operation ever produced. She had reached for it with the reflexive dread that had replaced all other responses over 11 months, and she had seen her daughter's name trending on every platform simultaneously, and she had been in her car before she finished reading the first headline. She drove 94 miles in 49 minutes. The federal agent who tried to stop her at the perimeter did not try for long. She came through the crowd with the forward motion of someone who has been stopped from reaching their child for 11 months and will not be stopped again by anything that physics does not absolutely require. The crowd parted for her the way it had parted for Clara, instinctively, completely, because some things announced their own right of way, and everyone present understood exactly what this was. Clara heard her mother's voice before she saw her. 11 months of holding the sound of it in the specific place where she kept the things that needed to stay real. Her mother's voice, the smell of their kitchen in the morning, the weight of her mother's arms when something had gone wrong and needed to be made right. She had kept it there carefully, the way you keep something irreplaceable in the tallest, safest space available. And she had been afraid in the worst hours in the bunker that she was losing her grip on it. She was not losing her grip on it. She knew the voice immediately, the way the body knows certain things without asking the mind for confirmation. "Mom." They met in the middle of the parking lot. Sandra dropped to her knees and pulled Clara into her arms with the force of 11 months of not being able to do this, and Clara buried her face in her mother's neck and made a sound that was not crying and not laughing, but existed in the space between all the words for what it was, and they held each other with the totality of people who have been given back something the world had no right to take. Ruth watched from 20 feet away. She watched with the attention of someone who has survived a loss that cannot be reversed, watching a reunion that represents the thing they did not get. Not with bitterness, not with envy, with the complicated tenderness of a person for whom someone else's intact thing is both beautiful and painful in the same breath at the same moment in a way that cannot be separated. This was why she had gone down those stairs. Not because she had known it would lead here, not because she had calculated this outcome and found it acceptable, but because a voice in the dark had called her son's name, and she had made the only choice that the person Emma had believed she was could have made, and that choice had led here to this parking lot, to this mother on her knees, to this girl finally home. She could not have her own version of this, but she had made it possible for someone else to have theirs. That was something. She understood now, standing in the Nevada dawn, with blood on her face and a bullet wound in her shoulder, exactly enough. Sandra looked up from her daughter and saw Ruth. She set Clara down with the careful deliberateness of a woman putting down something irreplaceable to do something else that cannot wait. She stood. She crossed the parking lot. She stopped in front of Ruth and looked at her, the wound, the dried blood, the swollen face, the one clear eye that had been watching the reunion with an expression Sandra could not entirely read, but understood enough to feel in her chest. She went to her knees. "Thank you." Her voice had been used hard in the last 49 minutes. "You saved her. You gave me back my daughter. I don't know how to. You don't owe me anything," Rutha said. "Just take her home. Keep her safe. Watch her grow up." Sandra took Ruth's good hand in both of hers. "You gave me back my reason to get up in the morning. I'll carry that for the rest of my life." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at Clara, who was watching them both from 3 feet away, with eyes that were very bright. "Your girl is the one who saved herself," Ruth said finally. "She called out in the dark for 3 months and refused to stop believing someone would come. She held 11 other children together with that refusal. She taught them to survive." She looked at Clara directly. "I opened the door. She kept the light on long enough for me to find it." Sandra pulled Ruth carefully into an embrace, mindful of the shoulder, and Ruth allowed it the full weight of another person's gratitude, which is a different kind of weight from other kinds and requires a different kind of carrying. Over Sandra's shoulder, Ruth saw the CNN chyron on a monitor inside the nearest news van. "Breaking: Kyle Reeves, son of Senator Frank Reeves, arrested in connection with Nevada trafficking network." She read it twice. The name Kyle Reeves occupied a specific address in Ruth Mackenzie's internal geography, the place where she kept the things that had broken her, the place where she had stored 3 years of grief and rage, and the particular helplessness of watching justice fail so completely and so publicly that the failure became its own kind of ongoing injury. Kyle Reeves at 22, drunk behind the wheel of a car that cost more than most people earned in a year on a highway in Nevada at night. Emma Mackenzie at 19 in a university sweatshirt driving home for the weekend. The mathematics of that intersection and what it produced. Judge Warren Lyle's courtroom 6 months later. The suspended sentence. Senator Reeves in the front row, and the invisible architecture of influence that had made certain outcomes predetermined before the proceedings even began. The monitor updated. Senator Frank Reeves arrested at Las Vegas residence, held without bail. Ruth read this too. She did not cry. She did not feel the surge of violent satisfaction she had imagined in darker moments she might feel when this day came. The satisfaction she felt was quieter than that, more complete and far less loud. The way a fever finally breaking feels not a triumph exactly. More like the return of something that had been missing for long enough that you had stopped naming what was wrong. She closed her eyes. She pressed the bracelet against her wrist and felt Emma's name under her thumb. She breathed. Dax crouched beside her. He had been waiting. She understood now that he had been waiting since the moment of recognition in the parking lot for the right moment, the moment when what he had to say could land instead of just being heard. He had the patience of a man who has learned that certain things rushed don't arrive. "Iron Wolves want to cover your medical bills," he said. "All of them. That's not an offer. It's just what's happening." A pause, and there's something else. "Daniel wants to meet you, my brother. He's been out of the Army for 8 years. He has a wife and 3 kids and a life that he almost didn't have." He stopped. "He never forgot what you did. He never stopped wanting to say thank you in person. Ruth looked at him. I saved a lot of people over there. I never learned most of their names. I know. He knows that too. Dax met her eyes. But his name is Daniel and he's alive because of you, and he would very much like to shake your hand and say so. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Yeah, she said finally. Okay. Clara appeared at her elbow. She had left her mother's side with the quiet purposefulness of a child who has decided something and is going to execute it regardless of what the adults are doing. She sat down in the space between Ruth and Dax with the unself-conscious ease of someone claiming a place that belongs to her, and she leaned against Ruth's good side, and she looked up at the sky where the gray suggestion of dawn had become something more certain, undeniably moving toward light. You're not going to disappear, are you? Clara asked. Not anxious, she had said it in the tone of someone confirming something they already believe, wanting to hear it said out loud. No, Ruth said. You promise? Ruth looked down at her. Red hair and freckles and eyes that had been in the dark and had refused to stop looking toward whatever light remained. I promise, Ruth said. Clara nodded, satisfied, and leaned her head more firmly against Ruth's arm and watched the Nevada dawn arrive. 3 days later, Ruth Mackenzie woke in a private room at University Medical Center, Las Vegas, to a world she did not immediately recognize. The room was full of flowers. Every surface covered the windowsill, deep with arrangements, in every color of cards in careful stacks, organized by a nurse because the disorder of their arrival had made the room difficult to navigate. Cards from 43 states, cards from 19 countries, cards written in languages Ruth couldn't read, which a volunteer translator had been quietly working through for 2 days, writing English summaries on Post-it notes and attaching them to envelopes. The first thing Ruth felt was a hand, small, warm, familiar, wrapped up around her fingers with the grip of someone who had decided on a level below conscious thought that this was where their hand was going to be, and who had not reconsidered this decision even in sleep. Clara was in the chair beside the bed. Her red hair had been washed and braided. She had new clothes properly fitting, bought by Sandra at 2 in the morning because her daughter was not going to wake up in a hospital wearing clothes that didn't fit. Clara's head was resting on the edge of the mattress, her eyes closed. Her fingers were wrapped around Ruth's. Ruth lay still and watched her breathe for a long time. Then the door opened softly. Dax came in with the careful quiet of a large man who has learned to move gently in spaces where people are resting. Behind him, Sandra Dawson. And behind Sandra, a woman Ruth hadn't seen before, silver-haired, direct-eyed, carrying a folder. Patricia Hale. 31, Hale said without preamble when she reached the foot of the bed. 31 of the 47 confirmed located alive, in the process of being returned. Active operations on the remaining 16. Prague cleared. Budapest cleared. People on the ground in 3 additional countries. She opened the folder. Kyle Reeves is cooperating in exchange for a charge reduction he is not going to receive. But he's talking, and what he's saying is dismantling infrastructure we didn't know was connected to this network. Senator Frank Reeves is not cooperating and will spend what remains of his life in a federal facility. Briggs pled not guilty yesterday morning, which everyone in the courtroom found difficult to reconcile with the available evidence. Croft has retained 3 lawyers and is saying nothing. Judge Lyle resigned from the bench and is attempting to negotiate. She paused. He will not succeed. She closed the folder. The Bureau is restructuring regional missing children operations completely. New protocols, independent oversight, mandatory database sharing across jurisdictions, task forces that report directly to Washington rather than through regional offices. She looked at Ruth steadily. These changes are a direct result of what you found in that bunker and of the evidence you protected. Ruth said nothing. 31 children are going home, and because of the 11 in this hospital and the one in that chair, Hale glanced at Clara, we have an understanding of how the network operated that we wouldn't have had without them. She paused. She held them together in the bunker. The staff tell me she was the one who kept them organized, kept them believing, kept the younger ones from giving up. An 8-year-old girl teaching a 9-year-old girl how to survive, and that 9-year-old teaching 11 others. A beat. I've been doing this for 20 years. I don't have a better word for it than remarkable. Ruth looked at Clara, still asleep in the chair. She's remarkable, Ruth said. So are you, Hale said. She extended her hand. Thank you. Ruth shook it. When Hale had left, Dax settled into the second chair, and Sandra sat on the edge of the bed, and none of them spoke for a while. It was the silence of people who have been through something together that doesn't reduce to summary and have accepted that. There's something else, Dax said eventually. Something Hale told me before she came in here. Ruth looked at him. Emma Calloway, he said, the girl who was in the bunker before Clara. 8 years old, mossing from the foster system. She was transferred out of the bunker 4 months before Clara arrived. He paused. Hale's team found her in a holding location outside Bratislava. She's alive. She's being brought home. Ruth was still. Emma Calloway taught Clara how to survive down there, Dax said. She made up a story about a soldier mother to give Clara something to hold on to. She used her own name, the same name just by the coincidence of what her foster parents called her as the thing Clara would call when she got scared. He looked at Ruth. Hale says she's a remarkable kid. She survived 4 months alone in that bunker before Clara arrived by deciding that she was going to survive, and then she spent however long they were together making sure Clara was going to survive after she was gone. Ruth absorbed this in silence. 8 years old, a child who had nobody, no mother who was a soldier, no family to come for her, no one who had left her a bracelet or a name to call in the dark. A child who had invented what she needed and then given it away. Does she have family? Ruth asked. No, she's been in the foster system since she was 2. A long silence. When she gets back, Ruth said, I'd like to meet her. Dax nodded. Clara stirred in the chair. She lifted her head, blinked, and oriented herself the particular coming up through sleep of a child who has been sleeping very deeply and needs a moment to remember where they are. Then she looked at Ruth, and her eyes cleared completely and at once. You're awake, she said. I'm awake. You're still here. I'm still here. Clara sat up straight and rubbed her face with her free hand. The other one was still holding Ruth's and had not released it, had not even appeared to consider releasing it. She looked at Dax and Sandra and then back at Ruth with the expression of a child who has been holding a question and has decided it is time. What happens next? She asked. Ruth thought about it. Outside the window, Las Vegas was doing what it always did, moving lit indifferent to the specific weight of what was occurring within it. The desert beyond the city was turning gold in the morning light. Somewhere out there, mile marker 113 was just a number on a highway sign, the kind of thing you pass without slowing down unless you know what it marks. Ruth knew what it marked. It marked the place where Emma had died 3 years ago tonight. It marked the place where she had gone to join him and had instead heard a voice in the dark. It marked the place where she had learned at the cost of everything she had driven there to give up that the world was still full of things worth being present for. We go home, Ruth said, and then we figure out what we do with the fact that we're still here. Clara considered this carefully. Then she nodded, finding it acceptable, finding it something she could work with, and leaned her head back against the mattress. Outside, the desert turned from gold to the full brightness of a Nevada morning, and the light came through the hospital window and lay across the bed and across Clara's braided hair and across the bracelet on Ruth's wrist, and the 5 letters on it were briefly clearly visible. Emma, worn almost smooth, still there, 6 years later, February 2029, Washington, D.C. The auditorium held 1,200 people from 61 countries, and it was the kind of space designed to make the individual feel the appropriate weight of collective human endeavor. High ceilings, clean, sight lines, the flags of member nations along the back wall, the United Nations seal on the face of the podium. The Secretary General occupied the front row. 3 sitting heads of state were present. Every major network in the world had a camera pointed at the stage. Ruth Mackenzie sat in the center of the 3rd row, surrounded on all sides by men in leather vests. 173 of them. The same men older now, some of them a little heavier. A few more years of living distributed across their faces who had poured over the ridge at mile marker 113 in the Nevada dark 6 years ago. They had come in buses and rental trucks, and for the ones who could manage it, motorcycles. They had filled the hotel 2 blocks from the conference center. They had been extraordinarily well behaved at every location they occupied, partly because Dax had been very specific about expectations, and partly because they understood what this day meant and had no interest in diminishing it. Dax sat to Ruth's left. On her right, one seat left empty, the way you leave a seat for someone who cannot be present but should be acknowledged, sat Nate Hall. 26 years old the night of the gas station and 32 now, he had resigned from Nye County Sheriff's Department 4 weeks after that night and spent the 6 years since working for the Thunder's Children Program. The Iron Wolves had built it in partnership with Desert Hammers and Mongrel Brotherhood and the 24 independent organizations that had attached themselves to the effort in the years since. The program had found 417 missing children, 417. The number appeared on the screens flanking the stage as the lights came up, and Ruth looked at it and felt the specific weight of it and did not look away. She had earned the right to look at that number, and she was not going to flinch from it. Among those 417, Gracie Holbrook, Victor Greer's member's daughter, found alive in a network safe house outside Bucharest 14 months after the night at mile marker 113 through a chain of records that traced directly back to the folder Ruth had pressed against her sternum for 3 hours in a parking lot in Nevada. Victor had told Ruth about it in a phone call at 6 in the morning. The flat contained voice of a man who has been holding something enormous for a long time and is allowing himself to set it down, and she had sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after the call ended, feeling the full particular weight of what a folder of documents protected by a woman who came to a gas station to dial had turned out to mean. Among those 417, Emma Calloway. She was 14 now. She had been given a room in a family Ruth had connected her with through the Thunder's Children Program, people with patience and steadiness in enough space in their house and their hearts to make room for a child who had learned early and at enormous cost to rely on herself. Emma was in the auditorium tonight. She was sitting with the other program alumni, 3 rows behind Ruth, and she was wearing a leather bracelet on her left wrist that Ruth had given her the day they met, the day Emma had walked into a room in a Las Vegas recovery center, and Ruth had stood up and they had looked at each other across the space between them. Ruth had not said what she was thinking in that moment. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be fully known by everyone present. She had just held out her hand. Emma had taken it. A young woman walked onto the stage. She was 15 years old now. The matted red hair of the bunker had grown out long and deep auburn, falling past her shoulders. She was tall, taller than Ruth had expected she would be, though Ruth had stopped being surprised by Claire's capacity to exceed every expectation placed on her. She had her mother's jaw and her own eyes the same shade of blue they had been in the bunker, but holding something different now. Not the darkness that had been in them that night, but the knowledge of it. The full understanding of what darkness is and what it costs and what it cannot ultimately take from a person who decides not to let it. On her left wrist, a leather bracelet. Brown and worn, the letters on it faded nearly to invisibility. EMMA. Ruth had given it to her in the hospital on the 3rd day when Claire had finally released her hand long enough for Ruth to take the bracelet off. She had held it for a moment, feeling the letters under her thumb one last time, and had reached over and fastened it around Clara's thin wrist. My son believed in heroes, Ruth had said. He believed that if you called their name in the dark, they would come. Wear this, and remember you were brave enough to call. That makes you one too. Clara approached the podium. She lifted her left wrist so the bracelet was visible, and 1,200 people and every camera in the room found it simultaneously. The auditorium, which had been quiet, became completely still in a way that was different from quiet, the stillness of people who understand that something is about to be said that they will carry for a long time. This belonged to a boy named Emma Mackenzie, she said. Her voice carried in the way voices carry when a room has decided to be absolutely still for them. He died 3 years before I was rescued. He was 19 years old. A drunk driver killed him on a Nevada highway, and the system let the driver walk free because his father had enough money and enough influence to make justice into a transaction. She paused. His mother, Ruth Mackenzie, came to that highway on the 3rd anniversary of his death. She came to disappear. She had lost everything, her son, her home, 3 years of her life, to a grief that had no bottom, and the desert at night seemed like the only reasonable answer to what was left of her. The auditorium was completely still. Ruth looked at the bracelet on Clara's wrist and felt Emma's name there as clearly as if it were still on her own skin. But she heard me calling through a ventilation grate beneath an abandoned gas station, and instead of walking into the desert, she walked down 30 steps into the dark to find me. Clara looked directly at Ruth in the 3rd row. She fought a guard twice her size. She photographed evidence with a phone that had 1% battery left. She was beaten and arrested and loaded into a car being driven to her death in the Nevada desert. A beat, and she got up anyway. The auditorium remained still. She got up because that is who she is. And because her son, this boy, this 19-year-old boy who had 19 months after she came home from war before a drunk driver took him, told her something she needed to hear, and she carried it for 3 years without knowing yet what it meant. Clara raised her wrist. Nobody disappears in the dark alone. The first person to stand was Dax Mercer. He rose from his seat in the third row with the unhurried deliberateness of a large man who has made a decision and is executing it without drama. And the men around him rose with him, one by one. And then all at once, 173 people in leather vests coming to their feet in a wave that moved outward through the auditorium and became something larger than itself, became 1,200 people on their feet, became the Secretary General and the heads of state and the camera operators and the interpreters in their booths, became the accumulated weight of everyone in that room who understood what they were witnessing and chose to acknowledge it fully. The applause lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Ruth did not stand. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the bracelet on Clara's wrist and let the sound of it move through her, not performing humility, not performing anything. Just sitting with the reality of a moment she had not believed was possible on a night 3 years before it, when she was pressing her forehead against a metal grate in the Nevada desert and saying goodbye to a photograph. She thought about the night on the stairs, the smell of that room, the 12 pairs of eyes turning toward the light from her phone. Clara's grip fierce and complete, the grip of a child who had decided this person was real and was not going to let go. She thought about 47 seconds and what they had meant and what had happened after the 48th. She thought about Victor Greer's voice on the phone at 6 in the morning 14 months later, flat and contained and carrying the weight of something enormous being gently set down. She thought about Emma Calloway walking into a room in Las Vegas and looking at her across the space between them, this child who had invented a hero and given the invention away so that another child could survive, who had never had anyone come for her and had survived anyway, who was 14 now, and wore a bracelet and sat 3 rows behind her in an auditorium in Washington, D.C., because she was one of the 417. She thought about Nate Hall, 32 years old, sitting in the seat beside her with one seat left empty between them, who had found a business card in his wallet at the worst moment of his professional life and had made the only call that was left to make. She thought about Emma, not the Emma of the hospital room, not the Emma of the bracelet, not the Emma of the 3 years of grief that had carried her all the way to a gas station at 2 a.m. with $18 in her pocket and nowhere left to go. The Emma of the kitchen table reading with his feet up, looking up every few pages to tell her something he had just learned because he couldn't keep the good parts to himself. The Emma who had believed in her before she had given him any particular reason to. The Emma who had been 19 years old and frightened in a hospital room and had tried in the last minutes he had to leave her with something to hold on to. He had been right, not in the way he intended. He had not known and could not have known that his words would travel through an underground room to a child he had never met, who would send them back into the world every night for 3 months. He had not been making a prophecy. He had just been her boy, doing the thing he had done his whole life, trying to take care of her, trying to make sure she knew something true before he had to go. But he had been right in the way that matters most, the way that true things are always right, even when the person saying them doesn't yet know what they mean. Even when the meaning only reveals itself years later in a dark parking lot in Nevada, when a child says a name into a grate, and a woman on the other side of it understands for the first time that she is not and has never been alone in the dark. When the applause finally settled, Clara came off the stage directly to the third row. She moved through the gathered crowd with the ease of someone who has learned that the space she needs will be made for her because she has earned it and because everyone present knows it. She stopped in front of Ruth. "Thank you," she said, "for coming down the stairs, for not walking away, for staying." Ruth looked up at her, this girl, this extraordinary, indestructible girl who had held 11 children together in a concrete room by refusing to stop believing, who had walked towards the man who tried to sell her and told him the exact truth about what he had done and what it meant, who had grown into the someone who stood before 1,200 people from 61 countries and said a dead boy's name like it meant what it actually meant. Ruth stood up. She was 58 years old and her left shoulder ached in the cold the way it had ached every single day for 6 years, and her lungs still operated at 60% on the left side. And there were nights when she woke in a cold sweat from dreams that had not yet decided to leave her alone. She was not fixed. She was not the person she had been before mile marker 113 either. The version before Emma died or the version after. She was something else, something that had been broken and had not returned to its original shape, but had found a different shape. One that held, one that could carry weight without collapsing. One that knew from experience exactly what it was made of. She pulled Clara into her arms. Clara held on. Around them, 173 men in leather vests formed a circle that was not symbolic and not performed. It was simply the instinct of people who had ridden through Nevada, darkness together, and had never entirely stopped riding together, forming the perimeter that the moment required, because that was what they did and had always done for each other. 3 rows back, Emma Calloway stood up too. She was 14 and small for her age, and she held herself with the self-possession of someone who has been through things that most adults never face and has come out the other side into something that is not innocence. Innocence was gone and was not coming back, but was its own kind of wholeness. She stood with her hand at her side and the bracelet on her wrist, and she watched Ruth and Clara and the circle of men around them, and her face held the particular expression of a child who is still learning to receive the thing they spent a long time not having, who is still tentatively beginning to believe it might be allowed to stay. Ruth looked across the crowd and found her. She held out her hand. Emma Calloway walked through the circle and took it. Outside the conference center, February sunlight was doing what February sunlight does in Washington, D.C., arriving at a considered angle, pale and careful, the kind of light that illuminates without committing, that shows you what is there without demanding you feel any particular way about it. Ruth stepped into it with Clara on one side and Emma on the other, and Dax behind her and the rest of them, spreading out in every direction, and a reporter pushed through with a microphone. Mrs. Mackenzie, what do you want people to take away from this story? From everything that happened? Ruth looked at Clara. She looked at Emma. She looked at Dax. She looked at Nate Hall standing slightly back from the group with the expression of someone who still 6 years later finds himself surprised that the phone call he made from behind a warehouse on Route 15 turned out to be the most important thing he ever did. She looked at Victor Greer, who was standing on the far edge of the group with his arms crossed and his shaved head catching the February light, and who gave her a single nod when their eyes met the nod of a man who found his brother's daughter because a woman came to a gas station to die and chose to go down the stairs instead. She thought about everything that would never have happened if she had taken 3 more steps toward the desert. She thought about 47 children, about 417. She thought about a 19-year-old boy who had believed in her before she had earned it. I want them to remember that it only takes one person, Ruth said, one person willing to stop, one person willing to listen, one person who hears a voice in the dark and decides that walking away is not an option. She touched the place on her wrist where the bracelet had been for 3 years, the ghost of it, still there in the slight difference of the coin in the place where the leather had pressed and the letters had worn, and the name had lived for so long it had left a mark even now. My son believed in heroes. He spent his last minutes trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear yet. It took me 3 years and a child calling his name through a grate in the Nevada desert to understand what he meant. She looked into the camera. Nobody disappears in the dark alone. That was Emma's truth. It's Clara's truth. It's Emma Calloway's truth. It's the truth of 417 children who were lost in the dark and found their way back because enough people refused to look away. She paused. It's the truth that 173 people got out of bed in the middle of the night and rode hundreds of miles to prove. It's the truth that a 26-year-old deputy proved when he found a business card in his wallet and made the only call that was left to make. She looked at Clara, who was watching her with eyes that were very bright. It can be your truth, too, if you choose it, if you stop when you hear the voice, if you go down the stairs. The camera held on her for a long moment. Then it found the bracelet on Clara's wrist and the 5 letters on it that were nearly invisible, now worn down to ghosts by 6 years of daily wearing, by Clara touching them when she needed steadiness, the way Ruth had touched them in the years before, and it stayed there. AMMA, worn almost smooth. Still there, still carrying the weight of a boy who had said something true to his mother in a hospital room and had not known what it would become, did not know it would travel through an underground room to a child it was never meant to reach, did not know it would be carried for 3 years by a woman walking toward her own ending, did not know it would be worn on the wrist of a girl who spoke it to 1,200 people from 61 countries, who would carry it home in their pockets and their hearts in their quiet private moments in the dark, when the dark gets heavy and they need to remember that it does not have to be faced alone. Nobody disappears in the dark alone. Not ever. Not anymore.